About 6 months ago, I got engaged to the love of my life. My boyfriend, I'll call him Simon, and I had been dating for 3 years when he surprised me with a trip to Italy. He proposed to me there with my dream ring. He had barely finished proposing before I said yes. We spent another week in Italy after that enjoying our engagement. Both of our families were thrilled when we came back and told them the news. I didn't want to wait too long before getting married, so we started planning the wedding pretty much right away. I didn't realize how stressful planning a wedding actually is. Immediately, I started feeling very overworked because I have a full-time job and was planning a wedding alongside it. Thankfully, my sister volunteered to help me plan the wedding, and Simon also made sure that he was very involved in the planning process. I knew the first thing that needed to be finalized was the wedding venue. Luckily, my uncle had offered us the use of his country house for the wedding. It was an elegant and large manor house with a huge garden. I have always wanted to get married in a garden surrounded by flowers, so it was perfect. It also had a gazebo, which would be in the perfect altar on which to have our vows. I was grateful that my uncle had offered to help us out like that, especially because my uncle could not attend the wedding himself. His job is such that he has to travel a lot, and he was going to be in Switzerland on the 24th of October, which is the date we had picked for our wedding. We had our first date 3 years ago on the 24th of October as well, so it made sentimental sense to also have it as our wedding date. My uncle bought the property around a year ago. His neighbors had owned the property along with theirs, but because of some financial issues, they had to sell it. They still lived next to my uncle's property, but they only had a tiny garden and lived in a small cottage that used to be the manor outhouse earlier. They had sold most of the property to my uncle to pay off their debts. I had met the couple just once when I had visited for my uncle's housewarming, but the woman had been very rude and unwelcoming. My uncle had handed me the key to the manor and given me free rein to decorate it however I wanted for my wedding. He said that it was going to be his wedding present to us. Simon, my sister, and I had gone to visit the house around 5 months ago to see what would be the best way to decorate it. When he saw how large the manor was, we realized that both our families and the wedding party could easily stay there. It was amazing that all the people that were the most important to us would be in one place. It would make the day of the wedding go much smoother. We were going to book rooms with 2 beds and breakfast for the rest of the guests. When we were looking around the garden, we heard someone shouting at us. My uncle had put up a fence to separate his property from the former owners. We saw that the woman, Sophie, was screaming at us, telling us to get off her property. I walked to the fence and said that we weren't trespassing. I tried to remind her we had met at my uncle's housewarming, but she just refused to listen. She said that she would call the police because we were breaking into her house. Simon then stepped in and told her it wasn't her house because it was my uncle's property. Even after she heard that, she said that because he barely lived there because of his job, that meant that his property was practically her and her husband's. I told her that my uncle had given us permission to use his house for our wedding. She said that she didn't care because she would not give us permission. I want to make it clear to everyone reading that legally she has no claim to my uncle's land. My uncle had paid the selling amount in full to Sophie and her husband a year ago. It's true that he hadn't really lived on the property due to the amount he traveled for his job, but that didn't mean that Sophie had any claim to his property. I did not want to argue with Sophie anymore, so I decided to call my uncle and ask him to tell her he had given us permission to use his property. When I told him what was going on, he just groaned and told me that it was a common thing. Apparently, Sophie did this type of thing regularly. Whenever my uncle wasn't staying at the house, she would behave as if it was their own land. I handed Sophie my phone and told her to talk to my uncle. I assume he had told her he had given us permission to have our wedding at his house. She just started saying that she didn't care because she hadn't given us permission. I don't know what my uncle said to her next, but she just huffed and threw my phone at me. She said that she didn't care if my uncle had given us permission. If we disturbed her, then she would ruin our wedding. I realized that there was no point in arguing with her anymore, so I told Simon and my sister to just let it go and focus on our planning instead of Sophie. We spent the rest of the day at the manor and planned how we wanted all the decorations to be done. It seemed like the wedding would be exactly how I dreamed it would be. Over the next couple of months, I found the perfect dress. It was a beautiful mermaid cut gown with beaded embellishments on the bodice and satin silk skirt. We booked our wedding videographer and photographer, found the perfect bridesmaid dresses and groomsmen suits, and arranged all the bouquets. Our caterer fixed a great varied menu, and we decided on a 3-layer red velvet wedding cake. Everything came together in the best possible way. Our wedding was on a Sunday, but Simon and I, the wedding party, and our families traveled to the manor on Friday itself to make sure the people we had hired had set everything up properly. When we reached there, we saw everything looked perfect. The chairs were set up properly, and there was a white carpet leading to the altar, which was decorated with stunning flowers. While we were admiring everything, we heard someone bang. The gate to the house opened and stomp over to where we were standing. It was Sophie, and when she saw me, she started yelling at me again. She said that my wedding had disrupted their lives. She went on that because of the noise that was made when the workers were setting everything up, she wasn't able to sleep. I told her that the workers couldn't have disturbed her sleep because they had only worked in the afternoon, and that they wouldn't have made much noise because there was no hammering or noisy tool work that went into setting up our decorations. She still refused to let it go and said that they had disturbed her nap and that she would not let us make changes to her property. I told her we had made no permanent changes to my uncle's property and that he had given us permission to decorate the manor however we wanted for our wedding. I was tired of Sophie's delusional behavior, so I told Simon to call her husband so that he could convince her to mind her own business. When her husband arrived, I told him that his wife's behavior was ruining our wedding, and that we didn't want her to come to my uncle's property for the rest of the weekend. Her husband apologized for her behavior and told her to stop messing around with us and to come back with him. She started screaming at him, saying that this was supposed to be their house and that this was all his fault that they had been forced to sell it. Her husband had clearly lost his patience with her, so he also yelled at her, saying that the reason that they had been forced to sell their house was that she had run up such a massive amount of credit card debt that they had no other option. When she heard her husband say that, Sophie stormed off. Her husband apologized to us again and went after her. I was glad that that was over and done, although I felt really sorry for Sophie's husband. Sophie didn't bother us for the rest of the weekend. I foolishly thought that it meant that she was going to let us have our wedding in peace. On Sunday morning, I walked down the aisle with my dad. Simon and I exchanged our vows, and everything seemed perfect. That is, until it was time for us to say, "I do." Just before I could repeat after the minister and say it, there was a terrible screeching sound, and everyone turned around to see that Sophie had driven her car into the house and ruined my uncle's rose bushes. She kept driving towards us, so everyone got out of the way, and she drove her car all over the aisle in our pretty floral decorations. I was so shocked and upset at how she had ruined our wedding that I started crying. Simon came over to hug me and comfort me while telling my sister to call the police. Sophie had gotten out of the car and was again accusing us of trespassing on her property and saying that we deserved to have our wedding ruined. Her husband had come over because of the noise and looked disgusted at what his wife had done. When the police came and took Sophie away, he refused to go with her and instead apologized to us and told us that this was the last straw and that he was filing for divorce. Simon and I said "I do" inside the house because all of our decorations had been ruined. Even though I was very happy about having married Simon, I was upset that my wedding day had been ruined. I called my uncle to tell him what had happened, and he told me he was going to take some time off of work and sue Sophie for trespassing and destruction of property. Simon and I then flew to Greece for our honeymoon. That is where I'm writing from currently. Yesterday, Simon surprised me with a minister and decorated altar on the beach so that we could exchange our vows again with no distractions. It was the best surprise I have ever gotten, and our second wedding was the most perfect and intimate wedding ever. Many years ago, in a land a few blocks away, I loved to ride my bicycle. Single mother, no car. It was nothing really special, but it got me all over town. I mostly kept on sidewalks because traffic can be filled with too many entitled drivers. I got to a corner and saw a car coming up the side street to the stop sign. The driver slowed way down, so I assumed he would stop where he was supposed to. He didn't. My bad, because I had already ridden my bike off the curb into the street in front of him. You guessed it, crunch. I squirmed my way from under the rest of my bike and the car and started checking myself for injuries. Just had a bruised knee, so I was very lucky. The driver got out of his car and yelled at me for being in his way. Didn't even ask if I was okay. And I yelled at him for running a stop sign. A passerby checked on me and called the police. While I was safely back on the sidewalk with the passerby, the driver pulled his car about 5 to 6 feet forward, dragging my bike. I think he knew he was in trouble, so he altered the accident site to look like he was already around the corner. Because when the police came, that's what he told them. He said he stopped, proceeded around the corner, and I just barreled out into his path. The police officer asked for my story, and I asked him to ask the driver to back his car up a bit, and I showed the officer exactly where we both were at the time of the accident. He was wondering how I could be so positive, but then, once the driver moved his car, I pointed to the scrapes in the street that my bike had made when I was hit. The driver got the ticket, and I got his information. I wrote several letters to him asking him to replace my bike, but he ignored them. I finally had to take him to small claims court to be compensated for my squished bike. He didn't show up. The judge reviewed all my evidence and awarded me the cost of a new bike, plus pain and suffering for my bruised knee. The court served him those papers, but he ignored them too. Now I'm frustrated. No money, no bike. And the real entitlement begins. I found another secondhand bike and start riding around again. I decide to pedal by the driver's house just because I'm curious. And there's a for sale sign on his lawn, so he's trying to move and make a getaway just to avoid paying me? I went home, gathered all my paperwork regarding the judgment, and head to the courthouse. There, I filed a lien against his house for the judgment amount. Then I called his realtor and informed her of the judgment and lien. She called the driver. Now, 6 months after the accident, I finally hear from the driver. He called and threatened me over the phone, telling me he had witnesses who could prove I was wrong about how the accident happened. I informed him that the time to have brought those witnesses was at the court date, which he missed. He told me I'd better take the lien off his house. I refused. He tried to tell me he could sell it, then he would pay me. I told him that's not the way it works. Pay me and I take the lien off. He growled something and hung up on me. 2 months later, I get a call from the realtor who wants to stop by and drop off a check. I sign the lien release and get a cashier's check, and my kids had a great Christmas. Edit. For all those who are wondering, his actual ticket was for not having insurance, not for hitting a pedestrian in a crosswalk. Bit of a preamble before I begin the actual story, which is a pretty lengthy one. I'm from a South Asian family currently living in a country about 10,000 kilometers away, having set up a life and doing pretty okay for myself on my own. I was recently engaged to be married this year. Enter the entitled family, EF, comprising the entitled uncle, EU, entitled aunt, EA, and entitled cousin, EC. EF has always been super competitive, always playing a game of one-upmanship. Throughout my entire childhood, I've observed them trying to keep the extended family indebted to them, making them indispensable. If it wasn't buying the cousins pricey gifts, it was through the random, unnecessary remodeling of the ancestral home. I went to study abroad, so EC has to, even if it's for a semester. I buy a car, so EC has to, even if it's with EU's money. I plan on getting married, so now EC has to, even though he's about 3 years younger. Cut to 5 months ago. My parents let the extended family and other relatives know that I'm preparing to settle down. Mistake number 1. Little did we know EF would be competing on this one too. After going through a bunch of candidates, we come across a potential match that, as luck would have it, is pretty close to some relatives we bond well with. We get talking, and pretty soon we find that we're really compatible, easy to keep the conversation going, similar likes and dislikes, essentially one of those matches made in heaven kind of deal. My significant other and I finally decided it was time to set a date. We let our parents take it further and we decide on a date. After that's done, my parents start letting the rest of the family know about the development. One of the first few people they inform happens to be EF. Mistake number 2. All this while EF has apparently gone full force about finding a match for EC. So proactive, in fact, that they apparently preemptively booked a venue, hotel, caterers, etc. for the big day far in advance. As soon as they find out, they scramble to let everyone and their mothers know how we went behind their backs, finalizing everything without consulting anyone. Until this moment, they had conveniently kept it under wraps that their particular wedding date is a day before mine, and that we had hijacked their big day. Over the past months now, I've had zero contact with any of these family members, although my mother had to field calls from irate aunts who are furious about not being involved in the decision. That is a major part of our culture. My father has to field calls from his brothers who are too dim-witted to understand that it's a question of two different nations, and it's practically and logistically impossible to change our set date to sate their ego. A couple of people actually had the audacity to push it to mid next year because some of them can't handle the cold. Then there are kids' exams to consider, and finally, mild bribery in the form of promises to pay for the wedding themselves. None of us wants a big fat wedding to begin with, but thanks for the offer, I guess. He finally lost his cool 2 weeks back and tells them point blank that they're stupid. He used another colorful word. If they believe that EF fixed the date, booked the venues, and finalized other major services for the wedding all in one evening, and people are free to choose which wedding to attend. We have essentially been boycotted for not kowtowing to EF and their wishes. Update. Just learned from my mother that they just had their engagement earlier this week. We obviously weren't invited. The extended family were all flown to the venue, and all expenses were paid. I'm thinking I should at least be the mature one and send them a congratulatory card.